Well, hello, my lads and my ladies, my girls and my boys, and all your amazing pets of the feline, canine, piscine, crustacean, or rodent persuasion. How have you been? It's almost been a month, I know, since we met in the penultimate episode of Tattle Tales, Season 1, and I've missed you guys. However, let's get used to the missing and being missed, because after this episode, I shan't see you for a while. Maybe for as long as a few months. I shall be using the time to take a breather, promote my latest book, Devadasi. You can order your own copy, as you know, at the Amazon link given in the description. Please do so. And perhaps I may start a new novel if inspiration strikes. I shall also use the time to replenish my stock of stories. I'm planning to alter the format of these episodes in Season 2 by bringing in a few guests and talking to them about their lives, careers, and of course any weird experiences they or someone they know and trust may have gone through. Essentially, a podcast. Interesting, huh? Well, that's me, constantly reinventing. Anyway, this last bouquet of stories is garnered from my relatively recent trip to London after a longish gap. In a role reversal, this time it was I who was visiting my older daughter, who now works and lives in London, rather than she visiting me on my postings. She lives close enough to Mayfair to allow me to pop across to all my old haunts. The trip in that sense was pure nostalgia. In the 3 weeks that I was there, she not only treated me to wonderful meals and amazing restaurants, visits to hidden gems within London that I had never seen in my 4 years in that city. Just imagine. And she also took me to some incredible theatre productions and art installations, living art installations, which was a terrific experience for me. She also took me to the stunningly lovely little city of York for a relaxed, dreamy weekend. And that's where all these creepy and tragic tales took birth. Even though I heard one of them from a friend in London who had experienced it for herself. I'm going to share them with you today in my very own style, as always. I'm calling this episode I Cry for You Every Day. A heart-rending phrase I borrowed from Susan Christensen's wistful poem, I Cry. Just 2 simple words. And they raise such a storm of emotions in your heart. It's dedicated to the last story in this bundle because I know it will shake you the way it shook me. As I mentioned in the last episode, I had ended up making a lot of friends during my London posting. As always happens, some fell off the radar as the years passed, but others have stayed on in my life to a greater or lesser extent. We make it a point to stay in touch, including by meeting up whenever I am in London or they are in India, or before I retired, wherever I happen to be posted. This time around too, I had a meal or a coffee with as many of them as I could. And it was fun exchanging notes on what had happened over the years we hadn't met. A couple of days before we left for York, I met a much younger woman friend who'd come to the UK as a student a dozen or so years ago and had since married and settled down in London. For the purposes of this story, I'm calling her Rupali, not her real name. An inveterate traveler before she birthed her now 6-year-old son and had her feet tied down to the ground, she had roamed extensively around the UK and most of Europe. When I mentioned our upcoming trip to the picture-perfect York with its rich history, legend-soaked landmarks, picturesque streets, and what the guidebooks referred fascinatingly to as ghosts in the gardens. More of that later. A strange look flickered across her face. It's a lovely little town, she admitted, as though you're walking through a dream, watching history unfold around you. Every time you turn around, you step on some fascinating bit of legend about wars and witches, beheadings and martyrdoms. Jayant and I spent a couple of entrancing long weekends there, during the first year of our marriage, and must have walked down every street, explored every nook and cranny, and listened to more tales about that one small dot on the globe than entire countries can boast of. I haven't been back though in nearly 8 years now. And I probably won't ever again. I blinked at her in surprise, taken aback by the unexpected declaration. "What do you mean?" I inquired curiously. "If you like the place so much, why won't you go back?" "Because your little one would find it boring?" "Because of what happened on our last trip," she stated flatly. It was just too weird, I guess. I don't mind confessing that I got badly spooked and don't want to risk it again. I still have nightmares about it sometimes, And poor Jayant has to wake up in the middle of the night to shake me awake to stop my terrified mewling. Good heavens! I stared at her. "You got mugged or something?" "That's what I tried to tell myself," she nodded, sipping absently at her coffee. "At least, could have been mugging, but..." She met my eyes and inquired seriously, "You do know, don't you, that the city of York is the most haunted place in the UK, maybe in the entire world?" "Well," I offered dubiously, "I have heard that the city is littered with ghosts, which is not surprising given York's long and rather bloody history. But I didn't realize that it held some sort of Guinness Book of World Records in hauntings." Which was true enough. Just a mite younger than London, the city of York was founded in AD 71 by the 9th Roman Legion, although human settlements in the region date back 8 millennia or more. Beginning life as the Roman military fortress of Eboracum, it rapidly expanded into an important provincial city, which became the capital of that province, and where 2 centuries later, Constantine was crowned emperor. In the 6th century, Eboracum became Eoferwic when the Anglo-Saxons established the kingdom of Northumbria and chose the city as their capital. Another 300 years down the line, the Vikings wrested Eoferwic from the Anglo-Saxons and renamed it Jorvik, which evolved into a major Viking trading center. The successive waves of conquest didn't stop there, however. In the 11th century, William the Conqueror, who became the first Norman king to rule Britain, sacked and nearly destroyed Jorvik, but it recovered from the damage to become an important urban centre and the administrative capital of Yorkshire County. The medieval period brought peace, prosperity and growth, so that York was soon second only to London in terms of affluence. Like all good things, the serenity didn't last long, though. The 15th century saw the city involved in the romantically named but rather vicious War of the Roses, fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and then again at the center of the English Civil War of the 17th century, during which it became known as a royalist stronghold. Besieged and captured by the parliamentary forces in 1644, it was finally liberated by the royalists. The infamous Guy Fawkes, incidentally, whose effigies are burnt every year on November 5, along with bonfires and fireworks, was a resident of York and was sentenced to death for his part in planning the gunpowder plot. To round off the turbulent history of York, the Luftwaffe bombed the city in 1942 during the Second World War, gutting several historic buildings. Miraculously, though, most of the city survived intact, and once the repairs and restorations were completed, became a major tourist attraction. As though the wars, conquests, and sackings and bombings were not enough, York was also the scene of the horrific Jewish massacre of 1190 AD, which culminated ultimately in the expulsion of Jews from the city 100 years later. And then there were the notorious witch hunts and witch trials that swept over York like a forest fire in the 17th century. Woman after woman was accused of witchcraft on the flimsiest of pretexts and hanged, burnt at the stake, or lynched by superstitious, frightened mobs. With so much blood and gore staining its streets and squares, it isn't surprising at all that virtually every second alley, pub, hotel, and historical building boasts its own resident ghost, or, in some cases, a multitude of phantoms. The city's paranormal repertoire has become an added tourist attraction, drawing visitors to the sensational witch tours and hair-raising ghost walks as night spreads its inky cloak over the fairy tale landscape. So yes, I did know of York's reputation as a haunted city, but what did that have to do with Rupali's could have been mugging? What she proceeded to share with me answered that question and sent a frisson of delicious fear through my spine. Now, since it was their second visit to York, Rupali and Jayant would sometimes split up to pursue their own interests for a couple of hours before meeting up at a predetermined spot. Usually some charming pub or quaint restaurant they wanted to try out. That day, said Rupali, while Jayant took off to the York Bird of Prey Centre to dabble in falconry, a sport his wife didn't much care for, she decided to go explore an outdoor market they had stumbled upon the previous day, which had some fascinating local crafts, jewelry, flavored alcohol, and knickknacks on offer. She spent a happy hour there, picking up gifts and souvenirs for friends and family. Since she still had another hour to kill before meeting Jayant for a late lunch, she decided to walk around the town. She slipped in and out of narrow, winding lanes that were a throwback to York's medieval past, except for the multitude of colorful window displays and adorable little cafes and pubs that lined them on both sides. At one point, she found herself standing at the entrance to what the locals referred to as a sickleway, a narrow passage claiming to be Lune's Court, formerly known as the Mad Alice Lane. They had passed by the place earlier and she had idly looked it up online, discovering to her amusement that it was reputedly haunted, like literally half of York. Since neither she nor Jayant were inclined in the slightest towards the paranormal, they hadn't bothered to sign up for any of the ghost walks offered to tourists, on each of which the Mad Alice Lane was a star attraction. They hadn't therefore done any more than click a picture of the name board at the entrance. Curious despite herself, she decided to step within the snickleway and take a gander at the site of the so-called haunting. It was, she recalled, around 1:30 in the afternoon, with the autumn sun shining brightly overhead and people strolling down the main street outside. A few steps down, the passageway broadened into a small square, hemmed in by old residences on every side, with several frosted glass windows looking down at the space. Rupali could see that while rather mundane in the light of day, the little square would look creepy at night, turning every shadow into a potential ghost for wide-eyed tourists fueled by preconception and adrenaline. Besides, although a couple of locals did pass her by as she stood looking up at the windows, and the sound of footsteps, chatter, and laughter drifted in from the busy street outside, the place seemed unnaturally silent. Surprised at her own unease, she quickly dismissed it as an instinctive response of her reptilian brain to the sad but spooky legend woven around the lane, and turned around to go back the way she had come. But then, as she told me wryly, Rupali decided to let curiosity kill the cat. In the opposite direction to the entrance, the square narrowed once again into a constricted lane, logically surmising that the passageway would come out on some back street that would be closer to the restaurant where she was supposed to meet her husband. She turned away from the entrance to the lane and began walking in the opposite direction. Barely 100 steps down, the lane split into two. If she followed the right arm, it would lead her deeper into the settlement. The left arm, which could be reached by stepping through an arch bisecting the wall, looked as though it would loop around the residential cluster and link with the next street. She sensibly chose the left branch, realizing as she crossed the arch that it narrowed even more a few steps down when the walls on both sides met overhead. Turning the snickle way into a sort of needle's eye, just broad enough for one person, or if you were willing to squeeze together, perhaps two, to travel abreast. The walls separated again a little further down, but only after you had walked a good 40 meters. Even though it was broad daylight, the looming walls blocked the sun, leaving the passage in shadows. She could still hear the crowds and the sounds from the busy main street at her back, but the lane itself was deserted. Ignoring the prickling along her spine, she began to walk towards the needle's eye, telling herself that it should take her less than 5 minutes to cross the lane and emerge into the next street, probably as busy and crowded as the one on the other side. That was when she saw him. She said to me with a tiny shiver, a man dressed in a loose white collarless shirt tied at the neck with laces, paired with dark gallist trousers. A bit unusual for a young man, which he appeared to be, and strangely, a hat. Not a cap, she realized, but a top hat. Something she had only ever seen in period films. He was standing just inside the tight archway. She was barely a few steps away from entering, and his face was entirely in the shade, so that she could only see a blurred outline, but she could feel his eyes on her, intent, piercing, and insolent as they raked her from head to toe. He did nothing but stand there, arms folded across his chest, completely blocking the passage with his shoulders, but radiating the kind of menace that makes your skin bristle with goosebumps, particularly if you're a woman. Rupali halted in her tracks, staring at the figure barring her way, her heart galloping in her chest as she wondered what to do. The man obviously wasn't there by accident. Had he been just another tourist or a resident and had seen her walking towards the slim opening, he would have moved forward or receded to allow her to pass. The fact that he simply stood there staring at her pointed to this being a calculated encounter designed to what? Scare her? Mug her? Kidnap her? Drag her into some dark nook and rape her? But it was the middle of the day, for God's sake, and they were standing in a lane barely 300 meters long, midway between two busy streets, thronging with people. Would he dare attack her here, where a scream for help would be heard up and down the lane and even in the streets on both sides? I'm just scaring myself for no reason, she scolded herself, gripping her shopping bags tightly. Perhaps all I need to do is walk up to him and say, "Excuse me," and he'll move away and let me through. For some reason, though, her legs wouldn't obey her brain's command. So she stood frozen to the spot for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 seconds. The man within the arch didn't move either, observing her like a tiger stalking a deer. Totally unnerved by that silent scrutiny, Rupali decided she didn't want to take a chance and, turning on her heels, began walking in the opposite direction, trying hard not to sprint. The walls drew together on that side of the sickle way also, but at least she knew that it would eventually spill her out on a street she was so familiar with. This is what I should have done right in the beginning, she thought fretfully as she scrambled towards the exit. She could see in the distance, glancing anxiously back over her shoulder. The man had made no move to follow her. She realized to her relief, he stood exactly where she had left him, his eyes burning into her retreating back. Trying to breathe out the tension, she looked ahead once more, and froze again, gut clenching with dread and hands turning into blocks of ice. The man she had just seen over her shoulder, standing inside the Needle's Eye passage, was now right in front of her, barely 30 meters away at the narrowest point of the passage, effectively blocking her way to the noisy street beyond. The same man, or a doppelganger dressed identically, his face shadowed by the same hat the man behind her sported, his unseen eyes raking her with the same insolence, and his body language radiating the same menace. Rupali's heart literally stopped for a moment, she said, until the thought flashed that the man she had left behind may have somehow sprinted ahead to block her way again. But this nickel way was so narrow that he would have had to brush past her to get to the other side. Besides, hadn't she seen him behind her barely seconds ago? The fear like bile in her throat, she quickly looked back. And there he was. The man in the laced up white shirt, standing still in the shadows of the Needle's Eye. And yet, when she whipped her head around, he was in front of her as well. Not merely identical, but the same person. I just knew, she told me as I sat across from her, fascinated by her reminiscences. Even today, 7 years down the line, I'm still willing to swear to that. I was trapped between the same person blocking both sides of the alley. So, what did you do? I inquired, my skin prickling with anxiety and apprehension. Scream. She shook her head, evidently disappointed with herself. My throat just closed up, and I could barely breathe, let alone scream. I looked back once more to find him still glowering at me from the shadows of the arching walls. But I thought that if I ran, I might just have enough time to slip through the arch into the Mad Alice lane before he or his doppelganger at the other end could catch me. So I turned around and prepared to make a dash for the archway while the man within the Needle's Eye still watched me. As I broke into a sprint, my feet feeling leaden I glanced fearfully over my shoulder to check on the man at the other end and found him gone. Not walking away from me through the 150 meters of passageway leading to the street outside, every inch of which I could see, but just gone, vanished, as though he'd simply dissolved into thin air. My mind refusing to process the anomaly, I turned my head to focus on my flight again. And there was nobody within the tight opening ahead either. There was no way he could have walked out of my sight in the 5 seconds I had taken to glance over my shoulder, because, again, I could see a long way into the passage, and there wasn't even a retreating shadow anywhere. Once more, it was as though the man ahead had simply vanished between one breath and the next. Totally shaken, she stood rooted to the spot for several beats of the heart before she jogged through the arch into the Mad Alice Lane. For a few minutes, she simply stood there panting, ironically just under the window of Alice's haunted home. She was trying to add 2 and 2 together and repeatedly coming up with either 5 or 3. Her brain scrambled to find a rational explanation for what she had experienced, but nothing made sense. Nothing except the impossible. That somehow she had stumbled into something surreal, something bizarre, and had encountered a phantasm, the lingering aura of someone malevolent, particularly towards women. Whether the man or whatever he was, and she was convinced there weren't 2 of them, would have physically harmed her, she didn't know. But the terror he had inspired in her had been real and absolute. Pale and breathless, when she finally reached the restaurant where Jayant was waiting for her, she confided her ordeal to him. He was, as you can expect, totally shocked and deeply concerned. However, he scoffed at the idea that she had been accosted by an apparition. It was just a pair of muggers, he insisted, lying in wait for some unsuspecting prey, and she had simply reached the wrong place at the wrong time. They had probably run away because they'd heard someone coming down the lane, he said, and impatiently dismissed her argument that she had seen nobody else in the Sickleway. You were too shaken to be paying attention to your surroundings, he reasoned, and dragged her unwillingly to the police station to lodge a complaint. The officer who dealt with them told them that theirs was the third such complaint about the same two men in exactly the same stretch of the lane, but the police had never found the culprits or even heard a rumor or gossip about a likely pair. In a town the size of a pocket handkerchief, it should have been impossible to hide from the law. But there it was. On an impulse, Rupali asked him if the other two plaintiffs had also been women, and if any of them, either of them, had actually been molested in any way. The officer looked surprised as he admitted that all three potential victims, including her, were women, and that none of them had suffered anything worse than a bad fright. Rupali and Jayant returned to London the next day, and she had since refused to go back to York, no matter how earnestly Jayant attempted to reason with her. I have a theory, she told me as she walked towards the tube station with me. When you go there, you'll find that there's a street called the Grape Lane, just beyond the entrance to Lund's Court. Around 300 years ago, its name was a bit different. Just replace the A with an O, and you know what I mean. That would make it, what, Grope Lane? I ventured, rather mystified. Actually, even that was a more decent version, she grinned. The word grope used to be suffixed with another four-letter word beginning with a C and ending with a T. She watched comprehension dawn on my face and laughed at my expression. That's right. And it was called by that rather evocative name because it was the town's red light area. Men would roam the streets at all hours looking for a harlot to enliven their night or day, as it might be. A lot of these quick liaisons would take place right out on the street, it seems, with only the shadow of a wall or some hidden cranny providing a modicum of privacy. I have a feeling that the Snickleway, where I had that crazy experience, was also the scene of at least some such encounters. I mean, it's just a 2-minute quick walk from the Grape Lane. The man I saw had probably been a patron, should we say, who thought he was entitled to do whatever he wanted to a woman since he was paying for it. He may have been a bit of a sadist who enjoyed the fear he evoked. Even if he didn't physically assault or hurt the woman. The fact that he frequents only that lane and only victimizes lone women, trapping them within the truly menacing aura he radiates. He probably confused me and the other two women, and God knows how many others who didn't report the incident for whatever reason, with the whores he used to hire and bring to that lane. The terror he incites is what feeds him, trapping him in that city, that lane, as effectively as he trapped me. Maybe I'm just confused, remembering that afternoon through a prism of unreasoning terror. But even 7 years down the line, I know what I saw and experienced. It wasn't a man or even two men dressed like each other to frighten me. It was something else entirely. We, my daughter and I, arrived in enchanting York a couple days later and had a dreamy vacation, exploring those winding streets, admiring the York Minster, walking on the thick Roman city walls, boating down the gently flowing river Ouse. And yes, looking in on the so-called ghosts in the gardens. These are essentially life-sized figures made of lattice-worked metal, set in beautiful gardens, both public and private, across the city. In the light of the sun, they look delicately charming, but in the dark of the night, they appear ethereal and insubstantial. Wraiths floating across the grass and among the flowers. Familiar with my fantasy author orientation, my daughter also booked us on a fun and surprisingly informative witch tour conducted by a pretty young lady wearing a full witch's regalia, including a pointy hat and a broom. She shared stories, legends, and mundane facts about the so-called witches of York, who were often hunted and even killed on the basis of superstitious accusations. Later the same night, we wove our way through silent streets and deserted alleys on a deliciously spooky ghost walk, with a guide pointing out a host of haunted sites, each with its own horrifying or tragic or wistful story attached. We walked through the formerly scandalous Grape Lane and then rounded the corner to enter Loon Square, or the Mad Alice Lane. Standing in the little square Rupali had described, we looked up at the dim glow of the frosted glass windows above as our ghost historian told us about poor mad Alice Smith. I'm sure you're all dying to hear that story since we've already referred to it. So I'll tell you what we were told that night. A young married woman, Alice was a victim of regular domestic violence, more widespread and socially acceptable in those days than it is today, thank God. The abuse apparently unhinged her at some stage. She began hallucinating some form of stress-induced schizophrenia, perhaps, and confessed to a series of crimes she couldn't possibly have committed, but which horrified and confused her listeners. One version of the story claims that she ended up murdering her abusive husband after a particularly violent episode. Remember the shockingly emotive Aishwarya Rai movie Provoked? And she was hanged for the crime in 1824. The other version of the story also agrees that she was hanged, not for killing her husband, but for the crime of being insane and spinning crazy stories. Can you believe that? Whichever version you prefer, her execution exactly 2 centuries ago is a recorded fact. Her tragic end appears to have trapped her soul within her unhappy marital home. Her distinctive shadow, dressed in the fashion of her time, has been seen by several passers-by on the panes of the window facing the little square where we were standing. Many witnesses, convinced that it was one of the residents pulling a prank, had run around to the front of the house, only to find the door locked and the house empty and dark. More chilling, however, was the other sign of Alice's lingering presence. Sometimes, late in the night, usually around 2 a.m., the neighbors and anybody walking through the lane would hear the shrill, high-pitched, sobbing scream of a woman in agony ricochet through the silent square, chilling the blood and making your heart thud in your chest. In 200 years, nobody has been able to locate the source of that hair-raising scream. And I did walk through Rupali's Sickle Way, incidentally, just behind the Mad Alice lane, as the guide took us through to the street at the back, just as Rupali had intended to. It was exactly the way she had described it, complete with the needle's eye in the middle and the lane clinching towards the exit on the other side. I shivered as I visualized her there, trapped between the same man manifesting in two places. Later, I quietly asked the guide if there was an eerie story or legend associated with that lane too. He frowned thoughtfully before responding, "Not a story exactly, but well, I've heard that some women have experienced something bizarre in there. I don't know how authentic these reports are, though." Of all the spooky tales we heard that night, there was one whose pathos fairly broke my heart. That's the one I've named this episode for, and that's the one I'll close this episode with. It was also the last stop on our ghost walk at past 11 in the night. The guide walked us out to the stunningly beautiful York Minster that we had already visited the day before. We circled it to emerge on a quiet street behind it, where we saw a plaque announcing St. William's College, hedged in by a line of elegant townhouses and a couple of cottages, drowsing under the half moon riding high in the sky. This, our ghost host informed us, was where the saddest wraith in all of York resided, in a pretty two-story dwelling with an attic, now known as the Plague House. We've all heard of the Black Death, haven't we? A devastating bubonic plague that entered England through London around 700 years ago and swiftly traveled to York, striking the city not once but 6 times within a span of 4 decades. It repeatedly wiped out large chunks of its population, leaving its socio-economic structures in shambles. Ironically, this is a word that originated in York itself, which still has a street named the Shambles. The city was still picking up the pieces of its former glory when another terrible plague hit it in 1665, lasting for a whole year. By then, however, the citizens had learned their lesson. The terrified population insisted, very sensibly, that the authorities enforce a draconian quarantine on the infected parts of the city to prevent the deadly plague from spreading. Very much like what many of us have endured recently during the COVID pandemic. Since most households on the street where we were standing were among the first to be infected, they were cordoned off from the rest of York, and nobody was permitted to go in or out, not even for food or water. Most people living on the street, including the family that owned the plague house, eventually died of the disease. All, that is, except the family's youngest daughter, who was maybe 11 or 12 years old. The child, left alone in the house with a pile of dead bodies and nothing to eat, would sit every day at the window looking out at the silent, deserted street, crying tears of grief and fear, hunger and helplessness, waiting for someone to realize that she was still alive and come to rescue her. No one did. Even the ones who did see her were too terrified of the plague to risk contact with the helpless child, leaving her to slowly starve to death. मेहंदी की ऐसी बातें जल न सकी जो बुझ भी न पाती, बिन तेरे हर ओर उदासियाँ, आजा रे मैं तो कब से खड़ी इस पार, ये अखियाँ थक गई पंथ निहार, आजा रे मैं तो कब से खड़ी इस पार, ये अखियाँ थक गई पंथ निहार, आजा रे परदेसी. A calamity like that, you see, leaches all compassion from most of humanity, turning us into selfish, uncaring monsters. Can you imagine the terror and the agony of a child locked in a house of death and left alone to die of hunger and thirst? Is it any wonder that her wraith lingers in the plague house and has reportedly been seen by many, sitting in the same window and weeping silently, her arms stretched imploringly towards the street? The 500-year-old cottage, widely regarded as the most haunted place in York, has been sold and resold a number of times. No buyer keeps it for long though, probably unnerved by the poignant apparition trapped in that window by her intense trauma. It's up for sale again, folks, in case any of you are looking for a historical home with an amazing view, and are willing to ignore the small matter of a resident ghost. Nobody paid her any attention when she was alive. Why should you care now that she's dead? Oh, and before I sign off on this York episode, let me mention the rather odd conversation we had, or rather I had, with a very elegant older lady from London, a retired judge, as it turned out, who was also visiting York. She was sitting at the table next to ours at the charming and welcoming castle tea rooms, where we were enjoying their famous high tea before catching our evening train back to London. She started a conversation with us, wanting to know where we were from, whether we were enjoying York, and which hotel we'd stayed in, confiding that she was considering moving to York, bag and baggage. So much nicer than London, don't you think? If she could find a pretty house with a garden, something she could never afford in London. We shared with her the highlights of our weekend, and I mentioned the witch tour and the ghost walk we'd been on the previous evening. The ghost walk in particular had been pretty amazing, I told her, steeped in chilling, tragic or creepy stories about this most haunted city in the world. Why didn't she join one that evening? I inquired. At that, she looked me straight in the eye and said in a totally matter-of-fact voice, "I can't, darling. I've had so many uninvited encounters with them already that I cannot risk being in places and in an atmosphere where they can find me even more easily." Intrigued, I asked hesitantly, encounters with whom? "The ghosts, my dear," she told me with a sigh. "They just don't leave me alone." Had my exasperated daughter not dragged me away, I'd probably have missed our train to continue this fascinating and totally unexpected conversation. A fitting end to our trip, wouldn't you say? So here we are at the end of this last episode of Season 1 of Tattle Tales with Sangeeta Bahadur. I intend to return in a few months, perhaps around my mother's birth anniversary in August. The format, as I said in the beginning, shall be a little different in Season 2. And you'll find the new episodes not just fun and engaging, but also, I hope, useful and enlightening. As you wait for me to return, do catch up with any episodes of Season 1 of Tattle Tales that you may have missed, the links to which are all available in the description. Also, if you've missed giving the previous episodes a thumbs up, please do so now. A great deal of time, energy, and creativity goes into crafting these videos for you. And seriously, it just breaks my heart when you watch them but don't want to invest even 30 seconds to like, subscribe, and share with friends, family, neighbors, and colleagues. Please do so during the break. Oh, and I would love to read and respond to your comments too, now that I have some breathing space. And if you'd like to be my guest on a podcast or even have me narrate your own bizarre experience as a story, do get in touch on Instagram at Bahadur Sangeeta, and we'll set up an online date. Well, take care of yourselves till we meet again. And in the meanwhile, goodbye, alvida, au revoir, adios, auf Wiedersehen, das Vidania, sayonara. जिंदगी रही तो फिर मिलेंगे. If I live long enough, we'll meet again.